Hello, everyone. I am very excited that we are here today. Councilmember Meister and I had a conversation a year and a half, 2 years ago now, about wanting to explore the possibility of creating incentives for developers to create more pocket parks, maybe rooftop gardens, community gardens, and how we can bring more green spaces into our city because we want community spaces for folks to gather and just feel the healing energy and the vibrancy of being in green spaces. And it's good for our environment where we can make that a possibility. We have a love of green space, and I'm so grateful for that. And so the symposium idea was born from an item that we brought forward, and it's been a while, but I'm really happy that we are here. We have incredible experts. Thank you for joining us today to give us your wisdom. Thank you, Ric, for working on this, and staff. And thank you to all of you who are community members and residents that I recognize that are also lovers of green spaces. So with that said, I'm going to have Councilmember Meister come up.
Welcome. Welcome to the city of West Hollywood and this exciting community conversation about the city's built and natural environment. We're excited to build off last year's well-attended Urban Forestry and Biodiversity Symposium that explored the essential need and fundamental importance of a healthy and robust tree canopy and the green spaces here in West Hollywood. This citywide community event will be examining how traditional relationships between public and private space are changing. A series of wonderful speakers will be presenting thoughts and ideas from multiple perspectives: economic, socio-cultural, psychological, environmental, and they will be sharing design strategies for new public-oriented spaces that have been implemented on private property through new development. From pocket parks to mini plazas, from paseos to community gardens, our speakers today will share their individual insights and then discuss options and opportunities through a moderated panel. After the presentations, it will come together for a community conversation where you can share your thoughts, hopes, and desires for the future of public space in the city of West Hollywood. And now I'll turn this over to Ric Abramson. Ric is our city architect and also our manager of our urban design and architect studio, UDAS. That's how I know it, UDAS. Everybody give Ric a big hand.
Thank you, Mayor Shyne and Councilmember Meister. You know, an event like this takes a huge effort to put together. So I want to start first and foremost by thanking some of our city staff, our long-range planning division, Emily Rotman and Christine Shen, our communications division, our facilities division, Helen Collins, Aaron Hammond, thank you. And especially to my UDAS colleagues, Garen Yawlis and Michael Barker, who did an incredible amount of work to put this day together. And also a special thank you to Todd Gish, who helped us arrange all the speakers, and without him, this wouldn't have come together. So it really took an amazing effort from many, many people to put this together. And we hope it's going to be a really important conversation for the city. And why is this important? Well, we have a completely built out city. There's no vacant land. And we have essentially a mandate from the state to grow by close to 20% over the next 8 years under the housing element. That's looking to integrate almost 4,000 new units into the city. And with those 4,000 units comes potentially 5,000 people or more, depending. And so we have this compression that's happening, right? More and more people and less space. And so open space, and particularly public space, becomes essential. And so how do we do that in a built-out city? Well, we are the creative city. Sometimes it takes a little bit of thinking in a different way. And so one of the things that the council has asked us to explore is how we can start integrating public open spaces into private property. And why does this make sense? Well, there is a changing relationship between public and private space. You know, when I was in school, I remember every design project, we had to do diagrams and put them up on the wall. And the standard diagram was your public-private separation, as if there's a line between them. And somehow you never cross that line. But the reality is that cities aren't about a line. They're about these blended relationships. And what's been happening more and more is that the private realm has been moving into public space. You know, it used to be we might have a few valet stands at the curb, you know, an occasional advertising kiosk or some other sort of private venture. But if we look now at our public space and especially our streets, we have rideshare businesses that are using the curb. We have e-bikes and scooter businesses that want to use the streets and sidewalks. We have robot delivery devices moving down the street. We have billboards that want to project out to get a better view over the public realm. So a lot of these private entities are trying to share this public space, and it's changing the nature of that. And so kind of on an opposite end, we're saying, why can't we maybe share a little bit of private property and benefit the public through multiple different types of little moments throughout the city? And so together, they start to have a greater impact. And so why are we looking at POPs and parts? This isn't a new idea. This idea really comes from New York back in the 60s. It was part of an incentivized zoning program where they were looking at adding public open space into private developments. Through the years, it's been mixed results. I think we'll hear about that a little bit today. There's been some highly successful projects and others that haven't been what they promised. So we're hoping that with our experts today, we'll learn some of the do's and don'ts if the city elects to move in that position. You know, I think that's something that our council's indicated they're interested in public space in general. So I think today we'll sort of throw out some ideas about ways that we might move forward. So to kick things off, a little bit about the program. All the events in the city start out with an acknowledgement. So the City of West Hollywood acknowledges that the land on which we gather, and that is currently known as the City of West Hollywood, is the occupied, unceded, seized territory of the Gabrielino Tongva and Gabrielino Quiche peoples. So the presentation today is split into sort of 4 segments. We're going to have 2 segments of speaker presentations, and then we're going to reset up the stage and have our speakers in a sort of moderated discussion with Councilmember Meister, and then we'll end by opening up to the audience for a conversation about the future of the city with respect to public space. But I do want to emphasize that we're not going to be talking today about the public realm like parks and streets. This is really about private property opportunities. So if we start about public, you know, what do we mean by public? The concept itself actually goes back to Roman times and the notion of civitas. And civitas in the Roman world was a social body of citizens that were united by laws that bound them together by some sort of agreement, you know, a shared sense of how space would be used. And to be a citizen, you were granted rights of collective gathering, but it also laid out individual responsibilities, individual roles in defined context. When you were in public, how you were expected to behave, act, conduct yourself, etc. So that was always part of the origin of the idea. But that this agreement would operate within a dynamic, involving life of its own. And so this sort of condition was what was defined as the public. And over time, you know, public roles and these rights and responsibilities that play out in different spaces started to shape public space. And public space became a component to not only public voice, but public activities, and together they worked in tandem. But the public realm, as I mentioned a minute ago, is really divided between those types of things that occur in the public rights of way and the parks, so it's streets, sidewalks, plazas, etc., and then the private property in which you might have the public welcomed onto private property, but there's a sort of different relationship because it's owned and maintained by the private property owner. And that's the part on the right is what we're going to be talking about today. So just quickly, a few examples of the way public space has influenced cities. You know, one of the most notorious and well-known is in New York, the High Line. They're taking an abandoned railway artery and turning it into one of the most successful public spaces in an urban environment. It really translated everything about its context, its microclimate, making spaces for people in a highly successful way. We'll hear a little bit more today about the economics and the economic value of these kind of spaces. So Highline is the quintessential example. Another one is Gardens by the Bay. This is a project in Singapore, which is a series of solar-powered super trees, they call them. And they really create a destination that has never been there before in the city of, or in the country of Singapore. It's a dynamic project that's gotten quite a bit of recognition, but it's really exceptional for its energy and its environmental consciousness. This project I came across years ago when I was studying public space. A little town in Graz, Austria, had a footbridge, and the footbridge was blown out by flooding and completely destroyed, and the city wanted to replace it. But the thought was, instead of just putting back the footbridge, why not create something that would sort of put the town on the map, so to speak? So they created this experience along the bridge that is sort of a pretzel or a knot in which an amphitheater and a cafe were integrated along the way. So you have a public space, this public amphitheater, right in the middle of the river. It's been phenomenally successful for the city economically. It's put them on the map. There's now tourism and a market change just with a single project about public open space. Another quick example in China, Shenzhen, China, water purification plant. This is, infrastructure. We don't even think about infrastructure as an opportunity for public space. But here they chose to create an elevated public space on the roof that is recreational and also performative. There's a little amphitheater for outside events. And this has also been a very successful public space on an elevated situation. The only limit is creativity when it comes to public space. Here we have a university building in Thailand where they, again, wanted to use the rooftop as a public space of the building. It was modeled off of rice paddies, taking cues from nature as to how to create public space and have a thriving ecosystem. This was also tied into a jobs program. And so it had other sort of value beyond just being a gathering space or the environmental aspect, because it put a lot of people back to work who had been displaced from previous issues with rice paddies in this area. So sometimes public space can serve many, many goals, and the best ones actually do that. And scale, doesn't have to be grand scale. Some of you might be familiar with the Disney Concert Hall in downtown Los Angeles, the Blue Ribbon Garden. This is a little sanctuary space at the concert hall that is a little oasis, a little escape. And so sometimes public space doesn't have to be very public, right? It can be more of a little oasis or sanctuary. So thoughtfully designed public spaces can have a profound and positive impact on social exchange, local climate, thriving economies, and public well-being. These kind of spaces make a difference in cities. And so today we're talking about POPS and PARTS. And what is this term? It's maybe not as familiar to us on the West Coast, but POPS stands for publicly oriented private spaces, or privately owned public spaces. It kind of goes by two monikers, but it's essentially integrating public focused space onto private property. And PARTS, we're using as a acronym to refer to those elevated situations, in the sky, so to speak, off the ground. So these would be publicly accessible rooftops and terraces. Understanding that in a built-out city, not everything can happen on the ground, and seeing some of the examples of the wonderful things that happen in an elevated situation. So POPS and PARTS are today's topic. There's so many typologies. We're going to hear about this today, but they can be in the form of promenades or laneways, shaded plazas, urban steps. As I mentioned, the elevated terrace, it can be in the middle of a building. It can be rooftop experience. So I think, in total, there's so many creative ways to integrate public space into the city going forward. And in increasingly denser urban environments, there is this interest to use underused spaces. And rooftops in particular, I want to kind of underscore, represent up to 25% of the city's land area. And so that is an area where we might also see some profound possibilities coming forward. I do want to make one sort of caveat, because I think when this topic was first brought up, there was concerns that in residential zoning, we were suggesting having public spaces on the rooftops of residential condo buildings and apartments. And that's not, I think, what we're thinking about in this case. I think in residential contexts, that's where the pocket parks and the community gardens make a lot of sense through some sort of shared intervention into the city. We do have some examples we'll be looking at today, but the rooftops, I think, are really more of a commercial zone initially. I think that's where it's going to make more sense. So I'm going to introduce our first panelists. We have three speakers, each that are going to take sort of a different lens or viewpoint on public space. First is Sophie Kvist from Gell Studio. Gell is a world-renowned firm that looks at the social life of cities, looks at public life and public spaces. And we're really privileged to have Sophie, who's an associate and designer with Gell. They have been a consultant to the city in the past, and we really value their expertise because they are foremost thinkers and leaders in the question of public life and public space. Then that will be followed by Candace Damon. Candace is chair of HRA and Advisors. HRA is another exceedingly well-known firm that looks at real estate and economics and the sort of value capture in cities, and understanding that public space plays a key role in local economies and how that fits in. So Candace is going to be sharing thoughts about that. And then Candace will be followed by Catherine Pacraduni. And Catherine's been working on some really interesting concepts that come out of Japan about how to integrate green space in a very creative and clever way. So I'm excited to see how she's going to frame this conversation. And Catherine is educator and owner of Seed to Landscape. And I hope she'll touch a little bit about what Seed to Landscape is as well, because it's a very important venture, I think, for cities going forward. So we thank you for joining us.